So I'll just introduce myself real quick. I am a Canadian. I'm autistic. Well, in terms of labels for leftism, I kind of cover a lot of them from anarchist to social democrat to socialist, mostly
Hmm.
like in favor of like left-wing libertarian policies, like
Hmm.
actual libertarianism, not, you know, not American libertarianism.
Hmm.
And sort of like just like as a key value, I guess like if we're speaking like you were talking about axioms earlier, as a key, my key values, I think, are agency, just human agency, essentially, and not in like the sense of everyone gets to be the best and everyone gets to try to be better than everyone else. It's
Hmm.
more of a matter of actually distributing people's agency and sort of the ideas of like happiness and like the utilitarian ideas of happiness, of human life, of just those kind of things of suffering as being utilitarian principles. I think they all kind of get like brought up within the idea of agency, as
Hmm.
in like if someone wants to live, then they get to live, sort of. So that's kind of like one of the major principles of my beliefs. And I sort of like you're a social democrat, right?
Yep.
And do you ever advocate for socialist policies, or do you believe that in the long term there should be a socialist government, or at least like a socialist economic system, or is that where you want the like is that where you want the world to stop at social democracy?
I am in favor of doing more research, especially with the more common spread and widespread use of worker cooperatives and seeing how they could function on a macro scale. Right now, the literature we have on worker cooperatives, which is sort of like, at least in my mind, would be the next like logical step towards like a more socialist country, so to say. We've seen mixed research when it comes to specifically like certain negative outcomes that could occur through, for example, like mandates or for super widespread use. There has been some, exhibition of positives, which are really beneficial in certain sectors here and there, but we just don't have the broad body of data that I would like before I mandate something like this. So right now, I'm in favor of programs that incentivize the creation and facilitate the creation and the operation of worker cooperatives to get more data to see how they function, and then depending on how that works, maybe looking into mandates in the future could be something. But right now, we just simply don't have the data to support policy like that.
Well, I don't doubt your methodology. Like I've lurked in your chat before. I rarely speak in chat,
Mhm.
but I've lurked there before, and I see like you actually know what you're talking about. But the thing is, you don't actually. The reason we don't have the data is not because it doesn't exist. It's because it's not talked about. Have you ever heard of Rojava?
Yep.
Okay, you have.
And the conflicts with Turkey, right? Turkish government.
Yeah,
Yep.
and like and whenever people talk about Rojava, like just for anyone in chat who doesn't know what it is, because it's not exactly very well known. Basically, the closest thing we have to an anarchist government, although generally it's considered to be libertarian socialist, which is basically just the bigger like if capitalism forms a capitalism and capitalism is the bigger thing
Mhm.
for like libertarian style socialism and anarchism, you have libertarian socialism as like the bigger thing. So it's generally considered to be that, and also it functions rather well. And yet I constantly hear from tankies, from right wingers who often share the very same views about anarchism, about left wing anarchism, because right wing anarchism simply does not exist. Um, I often hear there's no example of a functioning like of it functioning, and then when people bring up Ohava, immediately the idea is there's human rights abuses. Yes, there are going to be human rights abuses in places that are war torn. There, like I don't, I like I cannot think of a single state or government that has not been charged or accused of human rights abuses in the entirety of history. And so
Um,
I feel as though there's a lot of data that we have that we immediately discredit.
so here's the thing. I don't think that's data, specifically for Rojava, because I don't think that the like a study or like the existence of Rojava as like a state or as a society in any way provides us with enough like empirical ground to stand on in order to bring about like I don't even know what types of reforms we're talking about specifically on like most countries. So
I'm talking about participatory direct democracy. I'm also talking
so
about the
what
sort of
would that look
like,
like? What would like such a reform look like for the United States of America?
for the United States specifically. Firstly, like when we talk about how the world can change, the United States is on the far right end of the spectrum. It will take a lot longer for the United States to reform, if it is to reform rather than revolt, towards a more leftist type of government. Like it will take a lot longer than for some countries. I live in Canada,
Let's
where
talk
we
about Canada,
already
for
have
instance.
several
Yeah.
like sorry, what?
So let's talk about Canada instead then.
Yeah. Like I fully admit that when we like if we talk about moving Canada, I mean moving the US towards actual anarchism or towards left-wing socialism that is not reactionary, that would not really be possible in the next few decades. And just to very quickly summarize Canada's political climate, We have five parties. Well, about we could consider there to be a sixth. You got
Hmm.
like conservatives who are basically Republicans, but diet Republicans. Liberals who are the sort of same, just a bit better than Democrats. Claim to be a lot more progressive, but don't really deliver. NDP, which is like the Bernie party more or less. Pretty progressive Green Party, which is liberals but against pipelines. And then you got like some Quebec parties. So we have an actual system where we have multiple parties, and it works better than the U.S. But we still have first past the post. That's the first step in any country with first past the post or an equivalent, a plurality type system. In that kind of scenario, like the first thing that you need to change is that. Like if you look at America, and I have a theory that the moment that Texas turns blue, which is going to happen, the fact is that as older people die in conservative states, it becomes less conservative. And I'd argue that the moment that Texas turns to a purple or blue state, the moment that the Democrats win that election, Republicans will be the one asking about electoral reform.
Yeah. So, but what I'm asking you specifically is that, like, what would like an anarchist or like a socialist reform to like a developed country, for example? Like, what would that look like? Like, what's included in that policy?
From a reformist angle or a revolutionary angle, because I'm open to both. I'm against violence. I'm an actual pacifist.
So maybe
Uh,
I can phrase this in a different direction. What lessons can the United States or can Canada learn from Rojava, insofar as what does that look like when it comes to political action and political policy?
Okay. Firstly, that not only wealthy nations can form into anarchism. The fact is, we have this idea that we need industrialization, that we need to have this capitalist endeavor or imperialist. Like even China does the very same kind of imperialism. It's just less violent usually and a bit less capitalist towards less developed nations. We need to learn that as wealthy, industrialized nations that are capable of reaching far greater equality without actually that much effort. The fact is that if we can recognize that a state, or in this case, I call Rojava a nation. I don't consider it to be state. As like an anarchist, I don't really think it fully fits the definition. It's bordering on it. But I would say generally we just need to learn that if that can happen there, that is evidence that we are capable of reaching reforms here that bring us closer to that. And the kind of reforms that I'm thinking of, because of
Hmm.
course just to be clear, I take hours to get to the point. So I do appreciate you pressuring me towards the point. It's not me grasping her at all. It's just that that's how I speak.
All right.
So when it comes to like Canada and the US, I'll speak
Mm-hmm.
about both because not many people here are Canadian, I imagine. In both cases, we already like in Canada, for example, with multiple parties, which is the first step to make. In America, we need to allow the existence of other parties, even the Libertarian Party, which is a party that has almost no votes. So like the whole idea, like okay, we need to firstly make it clear that people who are further left than Democrats, like AOC and Bernie, should be allowed to run separately. The idea of being independent, meaning that you cannot win a seat, needs to be gotten rid of. We need to destigmatize having multiple parties. We need to basically, like even in Canada, we have this idea of strategic voting. You got to vote for the better party that isn't as shitty, or else the shitty people will win. We need to stop doing that because that allows us to have a short-term victory, if we can even consider it a victory. Like people who were unwilling to go for Bernie because they were afraid that he was too radical. The fact is
So,
that people actually generally want progressive change.
yeah. So basically,
I'm pretty about
so okay, like electoral reform, maybe changing like first past the post voting, changing, just making the system, maybe looking into ranked choice voting, or basically just
Mhm.
making the system like more, yeah, like more similar to the electoral systems of more like European nations, for instance. Yeah, sure, that's a
Yeah.
policy.
Well, that's one of the first steps. Aside from electoral changes,
Uh-huh.
we also need to be very clear. Like when people speak about tax, and tax is a capitalist act. Like nations that are socialist don't function the same way in regards to tax. So we need to we need to stop allowing conservative or Republican groups and organizations to spread propaganda that when taxes are raised on the rich, that it affects the poor in
So
a
what does that
negative
look
way.
like in policy? Like the prevention of them being allowed, like what, how does that?
Well, first things first, we need to actually lower taxes for poor people. We need to stop having it be like what we need to do essentially for like left-leaning groups, like leftist parts of the Democrats.
Uh-huh.
We need to have them advocate for less taxes for people who are poor.
So just
We need to actually
just
like the fact is
more steeply progressive taxation, basically.
Yeah, the fact is that if we
Okay.
lower taxes for the poor, it's a very similar to effect as raising them for the rich. Of
Mhm.
course, it won't help the budget as much. What it does do is make it more of a steep incline, which it needs to
Yeah, it
be.
gives them more
And
disposable income. Poor
like
people tend to put their money in circulation more. And there's more utility for like a poor
precisely.
person having $10 and a rich person. Yeah, yeah, we get that. So,
Yeah,
so
it's,
electoral reform, more steep progressive taxation. Sure, these are still things that are social democratic. So, what's a specific like anarchist or socialist reform that like lends on,
well,
Rojava?
well, that's why I'm speaking about like firstly, that's the reason I'm talking reformism here
Uh-huh.
is because you have to transition to social democracy within a reform if you're going to be reformist. If you're going to make it towards the left leaning the left,
Okay.
like
So,
I don't think
what
you can reform. Yeah,
specifically
yeah, I
can,
got
can
you.
we learn from
In
Rojava?
terms of
Maybe if we talk
in
about
terms of
European
Rojava
countries, like Scandinavian countries instead.
yeah, yeah, gotcha. In terms of specifically from Rojava,
Uh-huh.
we need to actually acknowledge that participatory democracy works. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to actually take that style of government and just say that we can apply that soon rather than having it be about like within reformism there's this idea that you need to change slowly. And I think that's not
So,
true.
so what
I
specifically
think
do you
you need to
mean when
go
you say participatory democracy? What specifically does that look like? What type? Because I think there's a wide range of different like models for participative
I'd say
democracy.
that well, I say that there are three main types of democracies, and of course there's like you have representative, where the main thing is that you're electing someone, you're electing people. Participatory means more that there may be some amount of representation, but that
Huh?
you're actually voting on like things like no confidence votes lean slightly more into participatory,
So you
where it
mean
needs
more
like
referendum
I
votes and
mean
stuff like that?
yeah, stuff like that. Like not that's like the very, very basic level.
Okay.
Those are things that are already close to participatory. I also mean things along the lines of people actually voting for policies rather than voting for someone to make the policies. Like legislative branches need to stop. The Supreme Court of the US, this is actually a thing that I almost forgot about mentioning. We need to abolish the Supreme Court. Like just straight up.
Okay.
It's an undemocratic institution. Like legitimately, there's no definition of democracy that fits the Supreme Court. Lifelong appointments
Okay.
they never resign till they're dead. Like
So,
we need to abolish that,
uh-huh.
and as a replacement, we need to actually have legislative branches that are elected.
So
Or
I have a
if they're
question for you
elected,
then
then appointed.
about specifically the Supreme Court thing. So in situations in which we need to make like decisions on legal cases in which you require like a fair degree or there are a wide range of different interpretations of a country's like constitution and different ways in which that might defend the out or affect the outcome of the court case, that's going to have like a really strong effect on precedent in future court cases. How do you suggest those issues be settled?
Okay.
um,
So there are
within
two
your society.
options. There are two options, neither of which I prioritize. The first option is to have like people assume that when the Supreme Court makes a decision that it's a court decision. It's not. It's a legislative decision. We need to have it so that we actually have a court more or less without an authoritative judge. So that's one of the biggest problems with courts is the judge making the verdict, or at least the judge
Well, in the Supreme
being
Court,
so
you have
influential.
a range of different like judiciaries, right? That
Yep,
vote
I
within
understand that.
amongst them. Uh-huh.
Um, what I'm saying more or less is that that it needs to be consistent. That if we are arguing for a major thing that has made it past all the like the state courts, all of the more like lower level things, then
Well,
we need
not
to have
necessarily passed, but been like pushed up towards the Supreme
yeah,
Court. Yeah.
pushed up.
Uh-huh.
If that happens, we need to actually have a trial with firstly equally funded sides, and even if there are more than two sides on it, we need to actually represent each option, and there needs to be participation from the actual voters in regards to this. It does not need to
So
be a
like a
decision that we
referendum
are
vote
watching.
then, sort of.
Referendum, yes, referendum with aspects of like a court trial.
Okay, so my issue with this specifically is that I don't know in this specific instance if like an average individual within a democracy, if they would be able to like specifically sift through the intricacies in interpretation when it comes to looking through different precedents set before, and if I trust the average person to grasp the really far-reaching potential effects that this could have on future like law cases and legal cases and
Okay?
such like that, in which is the reason why I think a system in which we have like specifically appointed highly educated individuals that are put there and appointed there by democratically elected leaders is probably the best way by which to run this
I strongly
specifically.
disagree. Um,
Okay, why?
I will actually debate you on that. Like, I don't really like debates. I don't mean debate as in like let's argue. I mean actually showing the points.
Okay.
Um, like I don't plan to yell at you or anything.
Okay.
First things first. When it comes to sort of when it comes to the idea of like highly educated people being the ones running the world, no, that's the reason. The problem with that is not that they're not highly educated. Like, I'm not anti-intellectual. I believe that people like Elon Musk do know more about the things they're working on than the average person. But that's
Okay.
part of the issue is that these are people. These are people. That's I could just end the sentence there. We should not be having small amounts of individuals running such large groups. Like, psychologically speaking, a lot of studies recently are coming out like on like neuroscience type things
Uh-huh.
coming out about how having like individuals who are running large systems on their own, how that actually doesn't work, how the brain is not sort of programmed to do that properly, so instead of saying there are 300 million people in America, we adapt an identity for America almost as an individual or as a tribe. And in doing that, we end up basically failing to govern democratically, even if we're democratically elected.
So to be clear, what are the like specific findings of these studies that you talk about here?
Well, there are multiple of them, and of course, and it's different. Like, I can show you some of them. Um, generally, the consensus is that when we have leaders who are essentially working with amounts of people that they'll never actually get to meet, like if we have, for example, like a president or even a governor. A governor works with more people than they'll ever meet in their entire life.
Hmm.
So the brain takes shortcuts, as we often do. Like, just as we have biases in
Yep.
regards to stereotypes and all that, we also will apply a group identity to an entire area. And then we turn things so simple that as an individual, we are not able to actually comprehend what we're really doing. And the personal aspect of that, there's also the matter of conflicts of interest. I think any situation where there could be a conflict of interest, that situation should not even occur. We should not, if there is a conflict of interest, then we are doing it wrong. If there's ever, because we have enough people in the U.S. who are educated on these things that we don't need to have five of them. We don't need to have seven of them. We don't need to have 100 of them. We need more than that. The fact is, the more people we have who are making like I don't advocate for everyone voting on everything. I'm not saying that all the random white cis men should be voting on trans rights. I do believe that we should have like people who are voting for what affects them primarily. And the same goes for actual like
Okay,
wars.
so
We
if
should
we're
not
talking
we should not
about
be voting.
like Supreme Court stuff specifically, well, I can agree that to some point, like one of the limitations of representative democracy is that, like, obviously it's like not everyone's interest gets represented. Yeah, I agree with that specifically. I agree with that absolutely. But specifically when it comes to like Supreme Court cases in which the outcomes of that court will set legal precedents that will echo throughout decades of, like legal history going forward from that point in time.
And that's
I don't know if
a
I
bit of
would if I would trust the like a general population to be able to comprehend the gravity and the intricacies of those specific legal decisions, and that's why, like, I
I
would,
strongly disagree. That's okay. Sorry, I'll let you finish. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
yeah, and that's why I would rather see people that are I guess like indirectly democratically appointed by or democratically elected representatives go up there and run those decisions because I trust them to a higher degree than I would trust the average American in this instance to comprehend and to understand the intricacies of those given court cases.
Well, when you vote for someone, are you voting for everything they're going to do in office? I don't think that's a
Well,
rhetorical question.
you're giving them the political power to do what they intend to do in office.
We should not be giving people more political power than if someone is making a promise on their like if we are to still have the representative democracy that we have well that you guys have in America,
Well, I'm not
and someone
American.
gets
I'm a
voted
Euro,
on
I'm a Swede
I'm
actually,
sorry,
but that's
sorry.
okay. That's okay.
It's kind of weird that neither of us are American and yet we're speaking on American policy
Yeah,
as though that's the default thing to speak on.
yeah. I mean,
It's weird.
American.
I don't
What's it
understand.
called?
It's
Cultural,
like
whatever.
I
So,
understand the politics. I just don't get why it's the center of the world.
mhm.
Um, but basically, if we are to have like a representative democracy where people will make promises and then get elected on those promises, if they fail to deliver on those promises through their own fault,
Mhm.
then they shouldn't have been elected in the first place.
But
Like there needs
then they get voted out next election.
they get voted out after 4 years of controlling the world undemocratically. The fact is,
Well,
indirect
there's also
democracy.
means by which you could like, should they break any like significant things, you could like remove them from office, right?
No, Trump did lots of illegal things, got impeached, and
Uh,
then a Republican group, like the Republican Senate, was did not convict him. It was through an obvious conflict of interest,
mhm.
and he stayed in office and continued to do more dumb things. And I'm not
Yeah,
like I'm not
and the
trying to
reason
bring
why they
something
were able to
strange.
do that is because the like Republican and there were Democratic constituents within America that voted Republican and voted to get those governors and those state representatives elected, and they were the ones that voted on the vote of no confidence, the removal of office, follow up to the impeachment trial. So that was like a function of democracy at the end of the day.
It was not whatsoever a function of
Well, hold on.
democracy.
Okay, assuming that the Electoral College is an undemocratic institution, and I agree with I disagree with the creation of that as well. But like,
I'm talking far beyond the electoral college. Like if we talk like you know like the legal idea of fruit of the poison tree, if you like it specifically refers to evidence, I believe, where if your evidence is obtained in an illegal way, it's not valid evidence.
yeah.
If if you apply that in a far more extreme way, at least, well, I'd say to this, we have so many factors that are inherently undemocratic that lead to a conclusion that
Okay,
we assume is
so I
democratic.
will ask you a better question. Okay, what's your alternative to the Supreme Court specifically? What's your model? How does that look like?
Firstly, referendum. Secondly,
So
in also
referendums. Okay,
interaction.
so let's go
Yeah,
one
the first
point at
part.
a time here.
Okay.
Okay,
You want me to explain further? Sorry.
okay, is it
Um,
okay? It's referendums and some other. Okay, do your thing, and then we'll go from
it
there.
it'd be participatory. You have actual people. You have people like if it specifically affects a group of people, then that group should be primarily the ones voting on it.
Yeah, but if it's going to affect the whole
I'm not
country, right? Like,
like a law on like for example transgender people in bathrooms does not affect cisgender people nearly as much as it affects transgender people. Their votes should be valued higher in that scenario.
okay, how do you like objectively determine that when it comes to like
You
some of
don't.
the
Nothing in America is objectively determined except for science. Like we assume that our politics, like the Supreme Court, is not objectively determined. You're
Okay,
holding
so
it to a
hold
higher
on.
standard
So
than you
okay,
hold
okay,
abortion.
let's talk about like transgender validity then. Okay, who votes in the referendum for whether or not they are determined as like valid and valid? Let's say that this went up to the Supreme Court. Who votes on that?
Everyone votes.
Everyone votes
But
on it.
the
So everyone
votes,
votes on.
everyone votes, but people who are affected by this have higher weighted votes.
Okay, how do you calculate that? How does that work?
I'm not a policy I'm not a policymaker. I would actually have to figure out exactly the number for that. The fact is that the actual what's the word? The principle on this is what I'm speaking on, not the exact figure.
Okay, sure. Even if we look past that, so in this situation, do you believe that the average person who will be voting on this specific on this question will be able to understand the intricacies and the precedents and the like long-reaching effects that the outcomes of this court case will
That's the
have on
problem
the
with the
future of the
education
nation?
system. That's not the fault of the democracy that I'm asking about. That's the problem. That's a problem with the education in America. If we fund the education, the democracy will be stronger. Especially the reason that
Do you
we
believe that
assume that
every
people
single
are
individual
uneducated is
will be able
because
to obtain a legal like education, like strong and sophisticated enough to have informed opinions on Supreme Court cases?
if we allow them to, yes. If we actually put the effort into it, yes. I
That
believe that people should be educated on what they are wanting to. If you don't have to vote on everything, I'm not asking that everyone has to vote on everything. If it affects you, if you're interested in it, you vote on it. That's why it's participatory. It's not forced. And also your arguments like here a lot of them have to do with meritocracy. You like well not specifically meritocracy, but that well it kind of aligns with it. You're arguing that the people are not educated or and should not be responsible for these situations. Our alternative is to have a couple of people that know what they're doing, but also know what they want. And what they want does not align with the general interests of the population. The fact is, people talk about this oppression of the minority by the majority. Since when did we ever have a functioning democracy where the majority
Okay,
oppresses the
hold on,
minority?
hold on. Before
It's
we go into that,
always
before
a
we go into that
non-democratic
specifically,
problem. Okay.
I don't think it's possible for us to like live in a society in which we have like a population that's educated enough on like law, on climate science, on economic policy, on XYZ, on minority rights, on like all of the super important like vital pillars of societal function. I don't think that's achievable, and that's why I believe in the
You're
election
holding.
of representatives who are specialized within those fields, and we can ensure that these people actually have like sufficient knowledge when it comes to dealing with these specific issues.
I don't argue that what I'm stating is perfect. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a politician. I'm interested in politics. I know a bit about it. You're arguing that my position has to be perfect to be better
No,
than
no, no, no,
than the
no, no. I'm
horrible
not saying that
alternative.
has to be perfect. I'm saying that the outcomes of these court cases in which you work within your system, where like there are a wide range of people who aren't educated on the topic to a satisfactory degree will be voting on this, and that the outcomes of that would be more negative than what we might have today, for instance, in a lot of places in which the people that are voting on this specific case have relevant education and information on the field that is being discussed and understand the ramifications in a better way than what like an average voter under your system would be able to do.
Again, not everyone is going to vote on everything. I don't think that everyone has the time to be educated on everything. That's not my argument. I don't think everyone has the time to vote on everything. That would be a lot of voting. And the reason for that, the idea behind that, is that people should be voting on what they care about, what affects them. And in that way, we're having a democracy where people are actually getting what they need rather than getting what they believe everyone wants.
Okay, so in that specific situation, then, how would you like? And this is like there's no way to. So, for example, I can imagine like a whole bunch of people who may be more conservative within society, like going super strong and like because it's maybe been inflated by like a culture bit, like going super strong on like legislation when it comes to like transgender individuals, for instance, where they might have no fucking clue about anything in relation to this, but because they personally have like an interest in it or they believe that they have a stake in the matter, they're gonna go in there and they're gonna like put in a fuck ton of votes where they have no idea about any of the actual ramifications of what they're voting for.
So in an argument with two options, the option that is chosen is meant to be better than the alternative. And in this case,
to be clear, I believe that option.
Please let me finish.
Okay, go for it.
Let me. I need to actually get through the point. I know that you're interrupting me when you think I'm done a point, but it takes me a while to finish the actual point. When it comes to that, the fact is that the alternative, for example, again, we're focusing a lot on transgender issues. I'm not specifically talking about them. I'm talking about the entirety of this. Like none of what I'm saying is only going to affect that group. It's not like I'm talking very broadly. When it comes to any issue that is, of course, culturally sensitive, and you're going to have people that are bigoted, I understand that. The fact is, though, that the current, like the undemocratic way that we run these systems, undemocratic way that the Supreme Court is run, always benefits the people that are right wing. It does not benefit. There's no time where the lack of democracy in America has benefited the left. Not a single time. So now you are worried that sometimes you'll fail when we failed up to this point through all of history. I don't understand why we are afraid of more democracy because people will choose. We've never had people choose. That's the simple fact, is that we've never actually given the people the right to choose. And this whole idea of like we're afraid that the conservatives will do something bad. Sure, they might, and I understand that could be bad.
So to be clear, here's the difference. Yeah. So we might have a society in which, hey, if we just become generally more left-leaning, as appears to be happening across at least the United States of America today when it comes to amount of people voting for Democrats and just electoral participation, for instance, and we work within like the system that you call undemocratic, what happens then? Well, we have like left-leaning, like liberal-leaning, educated judiciaries and judges vote on these specific cases of the Supreme Court. Sure, that's what goes through there, and they're just generally going to be more left-leaning because the appointments are going to somewhat reflect. If you want to make like maybe like appointments more of like a bigger like issue when it comes to like the runnings of campaigns, then yeah, sure, I agree with you. That should absolutely be talked about more. But you have that as opposed to like a society in which like you would have to either have one of two things happen. Either you would need people to be like educated, and I can read off a few of the things when it comes to like stuff that the Supreme Court has talked about, like arbitration, the death penalty, copyright, First Amendment, immigration, religious minorities, LGBTQ rights, mental health, like the treatment of tribes, like patents and trademarks. You would need that, or you would also need people to themselves be able to recognize their own personal shortcomings and lacks of knowledge when it comes to these specific things, and therefore abstain from voting in situations in which they don't know enough. And if we know anything about human nature, we know that it is extraordinarily difficult for human beings to be able to look at their level of knowledge in a sort of like in a reasonable and an objective way. I mean, that's the entire basis behind like Dunning-Kruger as like an effector, right?
Yeah, I understand Dunning-Kruger. I understand what you're talking about. The simple fact is that in your talk about human nature, you fail to understand that the people that we elect to represent us are also humans, and they will always fail to represent people properly. And when you talk about the Supreme Court, you talk about a couple individuals. Those are humans, and they are not liberal currently. The fact is, what people want in America, firstly, a lot of people in America are not voting, and that's not because because like they're not educated. It's because they don't feel represented. To actually allow for people to participate in a democracy to the extent that I speak of, the reason that and firstly, this is already happening. Like some of the things in Mojave are beyond what I'm talking about. Some of them are still reaching there, and they're doing it the best they can. Of course, there are going to be fucking shortcomings, but the fact is that I'm arguing for better, and what you're arguing against is people having the right to choose because you're afraid that people will choose the wrong thing. That's not people when we don't allow people to choose in the first place, like what we have right now. It's never going to lead to the right thing. It's never going to lead to what people actually need. So it's like I
But you're
understand that there's
stating
no.
this. I don't believe, I'm sorry, I don't believe that the average citizen will have like super specific education on the intricacies of patents and
They don't
trademarks
need
and
to.
climate change and climate science and stuff like that. And also to
Do
be
they
able to
need
understand when they are having shortcomings, like in these
Supreme Court
specific
is not.
departments.
It's not that. The Supreme Court is not actually that educated
A
on these
hell of
things.
a
They
lot more
understand law,
educated than what the average citizen is.
and they're also a hell of a lot more biased. And they're in an entire lifetime. These people are the fucking kings deciding what happens to the serfs. You do understand that that analogy works
Sure. If
because
you're talking
they're
about
elected to
reforms
last
to
long.
the term limit
I'm not
to
advocating
terms
for reforms. I'm
and
advocating for
supreme.
the I'm advocating for the abolition of a
Sure.
system that has always functioned against the will of the people.
So
The
then
times the
don't bring
times that
up
I
issues
actually
that can be
advocate for
resolved with
liberal politics.
reforms, such as, for example, the fact that people are put on there for life. I think that's probably could be changed with like term limits and stuff like that. Like kind of similar to how
Sure,
like the
yeah,
general electoral.
okay, I understand. I spoke of mostly reformism here because that's where your platform is. I advocate for both. I advocate for reform all the time and revolution when necessary through mass strikes. I do not advocate for violence. I believe that violent revolution is immoral at its nature and that it will always lead to negative outcomes. Just to be very clear.
So
But,
just
like what I'm advocating for is mass strikes, like what happened in India
sure.
with like escaping with getting out of the British.
So
That worked. There's
why do you
historical
think your
precedent
system will have better outcomes? That's what I'm curious about.
because it represents people better. Because it allows people to actually decide what happens. And the fact is, the more people decide what happens, the likelier it are. Like when we speak about what's good, we speak about things that are new. We speak about things like progressivism. And the fact is, progressivism only came about when people were actually getting the right to decide what happens to them. The people's agency is the good unto itself. So when you act as though it might be a problem that people vote for a bad thing, no, that's okay. That will happen sometimes. The fact is that if we allow people to actually decide these things, rather than having an oligarchy or where we claim that it's a meritocracy, but it's really not, then if we don't actually allow people to choose, then things won't get better. Like through all of history,
Okay.
the main consistency is that as things got more democratic, things got more progressive, things got a bit better. And now we're backsliding currently.
Okay, sure.
All
I
over the
get
world.
the divide there. Okay, I would just say that, okay, at the end of the day, hey, I prefer a legal system that is less democratic than the one you're proposing, in which we can actually ensure that, or we have a higher likelihood of making like science-based decisions when it comes to climate change and stuff like that, than a world in which a more like where like the level
I'm,
of education on the
yeah,
people that are deciding behind
I'm
these things
not
is probably going to be
I'm
lower.
not I'm not advocating for people to decide what is true. Just to be very clear, I'm not advocating for consensus-based truth. Like you're taking what I'm saying to the logical extreme, and I understand that because it's already an extreme idea, or at least extreme to the relative of our status quo. The fact is, though, I'm not advocating for people to decide what is science. I'm advocating for people to decide what happens to them, and that's the right of every human is to that agency. I'd argue that is a human right that is denied when we allow for meritocracy or a so-called meritocracy. You see, the simple fact
So
is that
you would prefer just to be clear, just to test your axioms here, you would prefer a world in which we have direct democracy and the majority of people vote towards insufficient climate change legislation that ravages the planet as we know it today, as opposed to a world in which, hey, those systems are more undemocratic, but they're going to be more educated on average when it comes to the people that make the decisions, and our climate change policy is going to be like better when it comes to preservation of like the natural state of the planet, for instance. Would you prefer the former than to the latter?
firstly that's a giant straw man. But yes, I
That's
would
not a
prefer.
straw man. If anything, it'd be a false dichotomy, but it's not a straw man.
You're presenting a hypothetical designed to make everything look bad. There's no actual point there. It's just the point that yes, things could be bad with my system. Yes, they could go bad. They already are bad under the system that you're okay with.
But the argument I'm
Okay?
making is it's even more likely for things to go bad under your
No,
system.
the world is already dying. The fact is that the people that are
Do you
causing
believe
this
that
world to
the
die are
average
not
American
democratic.
today
It's not.
has
Yeah, the average American may not be educated, but the average American does not own oil companies. The people who are owning oil companies are deciding what happens to the world. And if we make their vote worth one, and our vote worth 1, then maybe we'll actually reach that change. We are not going to reach climate. We are not going to fix climate change without further democracy. It's that simple. Under an oligarchy where the majority of these oligarchs are working with fossil fuel companies, and I could show you the numbers.
Okay, but how do you explain people within trade unions that work within these like oil sectors that don't own fucking anything, but that they're like pushing against like climate change legislation and laws because it's going to adversely affect their employment?
I don't really like. Firstly, it's not about their employment. The fact is that they don't care about that's simply what they argue for. They say that it's about the workers, but then
That's
they fire
them
all
representing
the workers
their interests principally.
Yes, their interests. Yes, a group like a corporation is not worth more than the individuals in it. It's that simple. That the ruler of that company, who acts as the king of it, who functions entirely undemocratically, can take away someone's livelihood at their will and can ruin the planet without being fully accountable for it. The fact is that like what you like, I have to make a closing statement here because I have to go soon. But just to be clear, what you're arguing for has not worked. It is not working, and the planet is dying. What I'm advocating for is a chance for people to actually decide to save the planet.
Or it could go much worse. That's also a possibility.
The world could be worse than it is right now.
Sorry? The world can absolutely be worse than what it is right now, 100%.
No, the world's dying.
Do you think it could be dying faster? Or do you think that the chances of salvations could get lower?
Like,
do you believe we're on the worst possible course at the moment? Yes or no?
Yeah, the fact is the planet is dying, and
that's not the question I asked. Do you believe it? Do you honestly believe things cannot get any worse at the moment?
I believe that when the planet is dead and no humans are alive, that it will.
You're not answering my question. I have to ask it again. Do you believe that things cannot get any worse at the moment?
In what way? We were talking about climate change. I'm saying that it cannot get worse.
Do you?
I'm saying that you're pivoting towards. I'm saying you're pivoting towards a far broader point while I'm responding.
Okay, so let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about climate change specifically. Do you honestly believe that things like couldn't get any worse when it comes to our handling of climate change?
I think that we're tricking ourselves into thinking that we're doing something right.
You're still not answering my question.
Yes, sure, it could get worse. The fact
perfect.
Is,
that's all I wanted. Okay,
you're going to stretch that. You're going to stretch that into the fact. Fact is that you are advocating for a failed system, and you are afraid of actually reaching change because it could go bad. Everything in the world could go bad. The fact is that we take risks constantly. I'm advocating for a chance at doing things right and actually representing everyone's interests in a way that is democratic. And you're pushing back because you're afraid of a possible future, and I don't understand that.
And I think that outcome could be worse than where we're headed at right now. I can envision a number of ways by which we can work within the given system today in order to try to resolve the situations. But once again, I have to go back to like a separate question as well, because it's important that we answer this question, because fundamentally you said before that the greatest thing of all that you value is an individual's ability to like self-govern or have an influence or have a say in the decisions that concern them. So when it comes to the question I asked you before, when it comes to, hey, would you rather support a completely democratic society in which the outcomes that are voted thereon are negative for the planet as a whole, if we're talking about climate change, for instance, as opposed to a system in which it's less democratic, but we have better policy when it comes to accepting climate change? I need you to answer this question. Which one of these two would you prefer?
I'll give you an answer that actually works for you, okay? Because the answer I gave is it seems to be dodging the question to you. To be very clear, if we are to fail with a democratic system, then we can blame everyone. If we are to fail with a system in which it is not democratic, then we only have some people to blame, and we know that we could have done better. If we are to reach the things that I'm speaking of, and then we fail the world, and then the world dies, I'm happy with that because I know that's the best that we could do.
Okay, I need you to answer this question, okay? Which one of those two situations would you prefer?
The one that I'm advocating for.
Okay, so that's not the question I asked you. The question I asked you specifically is, would you rather accept a fully democratic society that has worse policy, objectively worse policy when it comes to handling climate change, to one that is less democratic but that ends up having better policy? Which one of those two would you prefer if you had to pick between the two?
Within the democratic society, things can get better. Yes, I'm advocating for democracy. But you
need to answer this question. You really need to answer this question.
I think the question is just flawed in nature, and it states that like it has an implied principle that you haven't even mentioned once.
The thing I'm testing here, let's be clear. The thing I'm testing here is if you actually value like the individual representation more than good outcomes, and that's what I'm trying to test you on here. So
yeah, I'm not a utilitarian. I believe that my principles will lead to better outcomes in the end, and that's why I'm against what you're stating. But I would still be fine with that, and I would prefer that to our current system, even if this turns out well. If we just incidentally survive climate change without people being represented, we still have we still then we know that it could have gone better the other way. I would be fine if there are to be bad outcomes because people represent themselves. Fine, but
okay,
I
so to
believe
be
that
crystal clear, you prefer a
yes,
democratic world with worse outcomes than a less democratic one with better outcomes.
yes.
Okay, perfect. We fundamentally disagree there. We're on completely two different sides of things. At the end of the day, what I value more than anything is the positive outcomes, is our ability to solve things, is good solutions to like things that we're facing in the world when
Good
it comes to
solutions can't
things.
be made from
And
people
for me
deciding
particularly,
them.
I don't have any strong like exactly like predilection about exactly how we do it, as long as the outcomes of that are going to be positive. And it seems right now from the arguments that I've made, at least during this debate, when it comes to pointing out issues, when it comes to an individual's ability to recognize their own shortcomings, and
Be very clear.
when it comes to the extent to which we can educate the individual, I believe that there's more risk to the system you're prescribing, and therefore, because I'm principally concerned with the outcomes and not the principle of people self-representing themselves, I would definitely, most certainly, like a no-brainer, prefer the system with better outcomes but less democracy.
Firstly, okay, all the hypotheticals all the hypotheticals you've given me are prepackaged. They are prepackaged, and all the wiggle room there. You imply the premise that my ideals will not work within those hypotheticals. It's you don't prove anything with that. All you do is that's the problem with hypotheticals, is you can phrase them however you want and you can use them as a manipulator of the conversation. It doesn't actually prove anything. All it does is prove that you don't think it'll work, and I don't. That's fine. It might not work. I acknowledge. I'm not. I'm omniscient. Neither are you. The fact is that you assume that I would know. I don't know. I'm taking a gamble. I'm taking a gamble for allowing people to choose what they want and for allowing people to actually self-determine. You're saying that you think that you're also taking you're taking a worse risk, I'd argue. You're taking the risk that allowing this oligarchy of people to decide what happens for everyone and allowing just a few, like how many people on the Supreme Court again? 9?
I think something like that, yeah.
Yeah. You're advocating that you think that those 9 people should decide what happens to everyone in Texas who needs to, like, you think that that's going to lead to good outcomes. 9 people who don't represent any of these struggles. These are all wealthy, old, lifelong judges who believe that their word is law. Like they act as kings over the entirety of these laws when they are brought to them. These laws that no one could decide on. They think that these 9 random old people should decide on, and you think that that is better than letting everyone have the choice, and you think that that's going to lead to better outcomes. It has already led to bad outcomes. I'm at 80% that can lead to good outcomes, and I believe that the outcomes. I am for saving the planet. I figure that should be obvious. I am for progressive values. This idea itself is inherently progressive. The idea that people should have the right to choose. The fact is that progress, social progress, and economic progress has only ever been made when people have been given the rights. And this is just another step of human rights, the right to self-govern. And that right will always, at least in my opinion, will always lead to better outcomes than letting 9 or 1, when it comes to presidents, decide what happens for full 4 years before we get to kick them out.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this can be the closing, because we're just gonna go back and forth here a bit. So number one, I do believe that there are substantive reforms that can be made to the Supreme Court. 100%. There's a few things that could be a lot better, could be a lot more reflective, and could have better outcomes. 100%. What we've argued here is like the retention versus the abolition of the Supreme Court, not about whether or not we should reform it. I think there's absolutely reforms. Number two, I am not cool with like gambling about the future of the planet with this, this sort of like new alternative model to it, which at least from the arguments I think I provided here when it comes to, the things I've already discussed plenty of times, seems like it could lead to worse outcomes than what we currently see. And thirdly, I think that when you state that you principally care about good outcomes, that is not true, because when I tested you on it, you seem to value the principle of self-governance more than you actually value good outcomes. So I don't think that's true, because when I tested you on it, you didn't pass the vibe check, so to say.
You gave me an ultimatum. Firstly, you gave me an ultimatum where I had to decide between my entire argument and the way that I'd reach good outcomes with a fully undemocratic system.
Yeah, the fact is that's how you test. That's how you test like what your key driver is, what you value the most. Is it the outcomes or is the principle? And you value the principle more than the outcome. So don't say that you value the outcomes.
Will reach good outcomes. That's what I'm saying. the implication of what you argued was that my principle would always lead bad outcomes, and that is not true. You don't know, and so you argue for what you don't know as though it is a certainty.
Well, so to be clear, none of us know for sure, but I have throughout this debate provided you with a series of arguments for why I believe it would function worse than what we currently have. And
All
once
those
again,
arguments are
so
hypothetical and not based on
that
reality.
example specifically was made to test what your core principle really was, if it was the principle of self-governance or if it was the good outcomes. And for you, it was the principle of self-governance. For me, it's the good outcomes, and that's where we fundamentally split.
You're not going to reach good outcomes without people being able to decide what they want. I'm just going to make that what I'm last stuff to say. I'm not going to respond to anything further. And people in chat are calling me a dumb fuck and all that, and that's fine. I don't mind. I'm that's fine. I don't mind. I'm not going to get annoyed at that. All I'm saying is that you value good outcomes, and I appreciate that. I also value good outcomes, but the reason I value people deciding their fate more is because principally that will lead to good outcomes. Because I believe at least that people deserve the right to decide what happens to them, to decide their fate, and that they will decide a better outcome than if we allow an oligarchy to do it.
Sure. Oh, he left. Okay. Yeah, I mean, what I can say is that, sure, I mean, but that hasn't been substantiated. That wasn't substantiated in the conversation. I made arguments against it. I don't think I received any good rebuttal for why my arguments against the efficacy of their system were, yeah, I don't think I received any good rebuttals to that. So I think we're stuck here, but